The best wedding gift would be if you disappeared from our family. She said it like a curtain being pulled, not screamed, not thrown in my face like a temper. She stood in my son's kitchen in that white dress, more silk than fabric at the time, the lace still pinned, and smiled as if offering a polite toast. The granite counter caught the light in her eyes, and nothing in the room moved but the little silver bracelet on her wrist. Michael leaned against the island, his hands in his pockets, eyes flicking between his wife and me as if the room could contain two truths at once. I had been standing there since the dress had been draped over the stair banister like a small cloud. I remember the fabric, the smell of newness, and the way our family photograph, Robert, me, a younger Michael, seemed to tilt in the corner. For a long breath, I couldn't find any sound that made sense. The words made a map of everything that was unsaid between us, years of help I had given, the nights at my kitchen table with spreadsheets and reminders, the house I had sold, the way I had sold, the way I had taken a mortgage off my back to write them a check so they could have a roof of their own. Amanda smiled as if she had offered me a compliment. I didn't know at that instant whether to laugh, cry, or simply walk out the door and let the world reset without me. What I did instead was the kind of small, deliberate thing that would have made Robert shake his head with a wry little laugh. I closed my eyes and counted to 5. If you're watching this and something here already feels too familiar, please subscribe and tell me where you're from in the comments. It helps to know I'm not the only one who recognizes that particular kind of silence. Robert used to tell people that decisions made in the silence reveal what you truly value. He would say, "You can tell a lot by the way someone leaves a room." So I turned, folded the edges of the dress very precisely where Amanda couldn't see, and walked out of my son's house with my handbag and a toothbrush. I did not make a scene, I did not call names, I simply closed the door with the quiet of someone who had learned that dignity doesn't have to shout to be heard. The memory of the Victorian house lived in the tick of the suitcase wheels I pulled down the sidewalk. People kept asking me afterward why I had sold that house. The question always felt too small for what it actually meant. That house had been Robert's and mine for 37 years. The maple trees on the corner, the rounded porch where I had read to a dozing Michael, the narrow bedroom that smelled like the perfume Robert favored on special occasions. It was not merely wood and nails, it was a ledger of our life together. I didn't sell it because I wanted to be clever. I sold it because I made a promise to my son in a way only a mother can, quiet, absolute, and sometimes impractical. When Michael called me the week they were house hunting, before the wedding planning began, I wrote him a check for $87,000. I had enough saved from his college fund after the last of his fees were paid, and the thought of him outgrown our home, of him and a wife of his own struggling with a mortgage the way we had, sat in my chest like a tiny, persistent ache. I told myself, in the soft way women tell themselves hard things, that I would get by. Robert and I had done without some luxuries. He had been thrilled to see his boy get a start without clawing out of debt. It felt like a gift then. It felt like a continuation of everything Robert and I had built. I had also kept accounts. It was a habit born out of necessity when Robert's health started to falter. Paperwork, receipts, the little details that keep a life intact. Over the years, beyond the $87,000 down payment, there were other checks I had written. Quick cash when the transmission blew, the uninsured dental work, odd expenses when Michael and Amanda's savings ran dry. Not a fortune, but not chicken feed either. In the ledger I kept at home, under Help to Son in tidy ink, it added up. $37,000 in smaller amounts dotted the line over the last decade. Together, the numbers read like a map of care. $37,000 in help and $87,000 down payment. The whole of it was $124,000. If you sit with a number like that long enough, it becomes heavy in your hand. So when Amanda folded her hands and suggested that the best gift would be my absence, the sentence landed on those old receipts like a clean, deliberate eraser. I went to a hotel that night because the idea of walking back into their house felt like pretending the words hadn't been said. I wanted air. I wanted to be alone with the noise of traffic and the hum of a television I did not have to pay attention to. The desk clerk at the Grand Meridian wrote my name in a careful, almost clerical loop and handed me a key card. The room smelled faintly of lemon and dryer sheets. I sat on the edge of the bed with the dress folded in the bag next to me and opened my phone. Margaret's number was the first I dialed. Margaret Chin had been Robert's lawyer the last 5 years of his life, and she had become mine by habit and by the kind of loyalty that ends up with paper files and hard copies. Margaret's voice when she answered was that rare combination of sympathy and procedural focus that people like us learn to trust. I didn't leave because I wanted to run away, I said, without preamble. I left because it's difficult to breathe in a room where I'm told to vanish. There was a pause, the sound of paper shifting. "Dorothy," she said, slowly, carefully, "tell me exactly what was written on that check for the house. Do you remember if it was a gift, a loan, any arrangement about co-ownership?" I had assumed it was a gift, the language I used when I went to the bank, soft words, not contracts. But Margaret's questions made me realize how much of life had been verbal, the way families sometimes transact on promises rather than ink. "I thought it was a gift," I admitted, "but we had a lawyer then. I signed papers. I paid with my own funds. Michael and I, never talked about percentages. It was all so assumed." Margaret's sigh over the line sounded like a small legal sigh. "Pull whatever files you have," she directed, "and don't give them back to anyone. I'll look into the deed and the escrow documents on my end. Sometimes, Dorothy, there are things recorded that people, family members, don't think to mention." I stayed in the hotel room and watched the lights outside the window, waiting. The television murmured a late-night cooking show. I called the bank just to hear an employee say my name in a recorded voice and promised to send copies of old deposits. At 2 a.m, I did what most people do when they are trying to make a complicated decision. I did small, careful things. I folded the dress again. I drank a cup of the hotel coffee and pretended, for a moment, that the whole episode would resolve into something simple, like a hangover. In the morning, Margaret called back. "What I found is what you might expect," she said, "but I want you to be clear-eyed about it. The $87,000 was not simply a gift. There was an agreement in escrow, a loan with co-ownership language. Recorded. It gives you, by the numbers, a 35% stake. The deed reflects that in percentages attached to the mortgage instrument." I stared at the phone until the line blurred. 35% was not a polite fraction. It was not a symbolic note. It was a percentage you could do arithmetic on, a share you could point to when someone tried to pretend the property was entirely theirs. Margaret used language that was annoyingly, calmly legal. She did not drama. She told me facts. That is the kind of mercy lawyers possess, the ability to turn emotion back into numbers. "You mean," I said, I own part of the house?" "You are recorded as co-owner to the extent of 35%, she corrected gently. "There are options in situations like these, buyouts, forced sale under certain circumstances, or a written agreement that acknowledges your stake and lays out terms going forward. But Dorothy, do not let anyone rush you. You have contractual leverage. We can use it to negotiate. We can also use it to protect you." Margaret's word protect felt like a cloak around me. For the first time since Amanda's smile, the world looked less like a room of accusation and more like a chessboard where the pieces had not yet all been moved. I called Jessica at Sunset Gardens Country Club. Her voice was breezy over the line, the practiced friendliness of someone whose calendar turns on other people's joy. "Miss Mitchell," she said, "everything's set for Saturday. The band is confirmed, linens are in, caterer's deposit received." "Are you canceling, Dorothy?" "Yes," I said. The word was small and precise. It had the finality of a stamp. "I need to cancel the reception. Please refund what you can. There was a deposit, I believe, $14,000? Her tone shifted a fraction, the professional equivalent of a half-step back. Contracts exist for details such as deposits. Jessica offered a list of clauses and dates and, after a minute, promised to call the caterer and handle the logistics. "I'm so sorry to hear it's not going forward, Miss Mitchell." It was not revenge, not meant to be. The $14,000 deposit represented not merely money, but a boundary drawn in ink. If someone told me that my presence was an insult, I could not, in good conscience, attend a day that was meant to celebrate the family being together. Canceling the reception was the single action that transformed the private dismissal into a public consequence. I knew people would call it dramatic. I also knew it was honest. Michael came to the hotel that afternoon with a look I had seen many times over the years, the look of a man who had learned to love two truths and hoped they could be reconciled. He brought flowers he tried to pretend were casual, yellow tulips the color of late afternoon sunlight. He sat on the bed opposite me because that was where our old habits could fit without talking about the bruise in the air. "Mom," he said, and then paused. "What happened?" "What happened," I repeated slowly, "is Amanda told me she would prefer I disappear from the family." He made a sound that was equal parts apology and denial. Dorothy, she didn't mean it like that. You know how she gets when she's nervous." I thought of the nights I had sat up with Michael when he was sick, of the way he used to call me at 2 in the morning when his problems came with shadows. She said, "The best wedding gift would be if you disappear from our family," I repeated. My voice was neutral, but the words landed like stones. Michael's shoulders slumped. "I shouldn't have let her speak like that. I'm sorry. You know I know you now," I said, "but that doesn't put things back in their place. I need you to understand the work I've done for you isn't an infinite well." The conversation did not go the way he wanted. I spoke to him about money, not in a lecturing way, but in a ledgered, fair voice. I told him, because mothers tell things, and numbers are a kind of truth, how the $124,000 accumulated. $87,000 for the down payment, $37,000 in various forms of help over the years. He listened like someone who had been told the exact count of a childhood savings jar. "Mom, I didn't realize it had added up to that," he said finally. "We never thought of it as equity or percentages. We thought you were just helping us, your family." "Family," I said, letting the words sit between us like an explanation and a challenge both. Family doesn't get to erase a person by fiat. Michael left that evening more heartbroken than angry. He promised to talk to Amanda and to think about terms. He did not, at that time, understand that my stepping back was not a vacation. It was a necessary recalibration. When you have given, sometimes the only way to remind someone of the gravity of that giving is to make the gift visible again, as paper, as deed, as possibility. You might be wondering at this point if my actions were vindictive. They were not. They were boundary-based, and mercy has always been better served with clarity than with quiet suffering. Margaret had told me there were choices. The moment I thought through the ledger and the legal reality, I realized I could either allow the daily small indignities to continue, or I could demand that their consequences be real. Consequences are not vengeance. They are instruction in a language some adults only begin to understand when the safety net is removed. By the time the cancellation call hit the news, yes, it made the local paper. Someone always knows someone. The farmhouse across from the club had been a stage. The reporter's voice on the morning broadcast called it a family dispute, which is true by a dozen definitions. The headline read, "Family tensions cancel myriad plans." I watched my face in the hotel room mirror as the segment played. My expression was the odd, disinterested look of someone watching their life get rewritten by a press release. I felt a strange distance from the small white box where my life was being discussed. It should have felt humiliating. Mostly, it felt clarifying. Amanda called the next morning. Her voice was sharp. "You can't just do this," she said. There were half words, accusations that wanted to be sentences but didn't find the air. "Do what?" I asked. "Cancel? Refuse to be told to disappear?" "This is elder abuse," she snapped. "You can't force us out like this." Calling something elder abuse reduced the texture of the circumstances to the single heavy word. It was a manipulation in its own right. The suggestion that a line drawn for accountability was actually a sign of frailty. I had no fear of the word itself. I had spent years being called things I wasn't. I hung up and called Margaret. "Expect something," Margaret warned. "Sometimes they go to the police to make that claim. It's a maneuver. Make sure you have your paperwork, the bank statements, the deposit lines. Whatever you do, don't concede authority without documentation." "How insulting," I said, but not to her. It was an audible beeline back to all the times a woman is told to smile and be grateful for the scraps. I had no intention of being grateful for any erasure. 48 hours later, there was a knock at my hotel door. I had been watching the rain rake the glass into little rivers. The phone on the nightstand buzzed, an unknown number. I opened the door to find a man in a gray coat, his badge courteous, a clipboard balanced in one hand. Detective Rodriguez introduced himself in the precise, neutral tone of someone who had seen domestic turns in many forms. "Miss Mitchell, we received a welfare check request," he said. "Someone was concerned about your cognitive function and financial well-being." He looked at me with neither pity nor heat, only a procedural interest. His voice was steady. "I need to ask a few questions and see some identification in documents." "Of course," I said. "I have them right here." I fetched my purse with the small, deliberate movements of someone who had always kept her records close. I slid copies of my bank statements across the coffee table. Every check, every transfer, logged in squeaky handwriting, receipts from car repairs, the mortgage paperwork that spelled out the 35% figure. Detective Rodriguez took the papers, his eyes moving across the rows with an efficiency that made me comfortable in an odd way. He asked about my hospitalizations and about whether I was free to come and go from the house. He wrote notes when I mentioned selling the Victorian and the reason we had given the down payment. He listened without commentary, and when he looked up, his face was blank enough to be kind. "Do you feel pressured or coerced into making decisions?" he asked. "No," I said. "I made those decisions myself. I have copies of everything from my lawyer." I could see his pen stop, as if the word lawyer quietly solved a problem he had been preparing to call in a different light. "All right," he said after a long beat. "We'll file this report, but based on the documentation you have provided and our conversation, there's no basis for an abuse investigation. If any of that changes, if someone takes your cards, if you start missing payments you didn't authorize, call us. But as of now, it looks like a family dispute." He was polite, professional, a kind of institutional presence that recognized conflict but did not take sides. His neutrality was the precise antidote to Amanda's accusation. It did not punish anyone, it simply filed the truth. After he left, the room felt a little less charged and a little more like a courtroom that had come and gone. I poured myself a cup of coffee and let the rain make patterns on the window. It had been 2 days since Amanda had told me to disappear. People use the word disappear to make threats and to demand behaviors. What Amanda had offered as a gift was in fact a demand for my erasure. The day the police left, I felt the line between being a person they depended on and being a person they respected come into focus. At the desk in the hotel lobby, a woman paused as she noticed me fill out a card. She was probably in her 70s, hair permed, a cardigan folded over her shoulders. "You look like someone who has a story," she said, offering me a small, conspiratorial smile, the way women do when sympathy is a shared coin. I thought then of Robert's laugh and the way he would once have said, "Dorothy, your life is half civic duty and half romance." I smiled back and said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, simply, "I have a few chapters." There were many chapters left unread. Margaret had told me the law gave me options. I could call for a buyout, sell my share to buy space away from deceit, or craft a conditional agreement that preserved my stake but demanded accountability. None of those options felt good as headlines yet. They felt like maneuvers a grown person made to ask for respect. The ledger was settled in rows and ink. The human part was still messy. When the hotel clerk handed me a small paper bag with a late checkout receipt, I thought about all the things women like me get taught. Be meek, be small, do not demand. Then I thought about the women who had taught me the opposite in quieter ways. Margaret, with her practical voice. Jessica, who had been kind in the midst of contract clauses. Robert, who had laughed when I took the long way to decisions because I liked my conclusions to be tidy. I folded the receipt into the old checkbook that had been with me since the Victorian and set it into my handbag with a small, careful hand. I had not yet decided which box to open first, the legal one or the emotional ledger. I only knew this. When someone tells you that your existence is an inconvenience, you have to decide whether you'll let that become your reality. I had money on paper and love that had been poorly reciprocated. I had a lawyer who did not panic and a son who wanted to be rescued from the storm he and his wife had made. The storm, I thought, had not yet run its course. The next knock at my door might still bring a badge or a reporter or one of them with apologies. It might also bring an invitation to negotiate in Margaret's office. There were things to arrange, language to draft, and boundaries to hold. I took a shower in the pale hotel water and dressed in the blouse I kept for meetings. The world felt like it had split along a clean line, before Amanda's sentence and after it. On the other side, I could see the shape of possible growth, slow, perhaps very human, perhaps unwieldy. When I stepped out into the rain again, the dress was folded in the suitcase like evidence. I did not know yet whether they would mend their ways or whether I would need to file for a formal resolution. The numbers in my ledger waited patient and insistent. Margaret's calmed voice repeated in my head, "You have contractual leverage. Use it to protect yourself." It is a strange thing to realize that dignity sometimes has to be defended with cold, hard paper. I took the bus back toward town because walking would have given me time to think, and thinking in the dark can be a dangerous luxury. The city smelled of wet pavement and frying coffee. My phone vibrated with messages. Some of them friends, some of them people who had heard the story already and could not help but add their 2 cents. Mostly, I ignored the notifications. There is a peculiar power in silence. It makes other people's words clarify into their true shapes. Back at my house that evening, in my small apartment that had once been an upstairs room to the Victorian, I sat at my kitchen table. I opened the envelope Margaret had sent. Copies of the deed, the escrow papers, the record that placed me at 35%. The numbers were ink on paper, black and indisputable. I laid them out like a deck of cards and felt the solidity of them under my hands. If nothing else, papers are honest in ways people sometimes aren't. I poured myself a cup of tea and thought about what would come next. Amanda had offered me disappear, as if the course of a life could be edited like a paragraph. Instead of disappearing, I planned to reappear in a way that would make my presence undeniable, not as a temper, but as a tempered person who had kept counting all along. The ledger had built me a map. It was time to follow it. Outside, the neighborhood lights blinked into life. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked into the night. I set the papers beside the teacup and opened my laptop to the message box that held Margaret's email about options. There would be a meeting, and I would be there, calm, prepared, and not small. I would not move because they asked. If a mother gives, she is not obliged to vanish. The next morning, as I locked the door to head to Margaret's office, my phone buzzed with a string of calls from unknown numbers. Amanda's voice, agitated and thin, left a voicemail accusing me of trying to force them out. Michael sent a text, an apology wrapped in confusion. I placed the device face down on my handbag and walked away from the porch like a woman who had decided the rest of the day would be spent making clear what had been murky for too long. There was a small piece to be found in paperwork. Legal papers, for all their coldness, do not expect you to check your dignity at the door. They recognize you as an owner, a participant, someone whose name matters beneath ink and seal. I liked that about them. It felt less like a fight plan and more like a codicil to the life Robert and I had built. Clear instructions on how to proceed when affection and habit failed to do the work of respect. I stepped onto the pavement and breathed. The rain had stopped. The city had a look of being newly washed. I thought then, oddly, of the dented letterbox at the Victorian, of Robert leaving a note to himself about the hedges. We had always trimmed the hedges on Sundays. Sometimes I missed those small rituals as though they were anchors. Today, my anchor was not a ritual, but a set of facts. Numbers, papers, a lawyer with a steady voice, and the memory of a man who had always said, "Take care of the people you love, Dorothy, but don't forget to take care of yourself." The meeting with Margaret was scheduled for that afternoon. I packed the deed into my bag, folded it into the pocket where I keep receipts, and walked toward the bus stop. Michael had texted, short, desperate. He wanted to talk before I signed anything. He said he wanted to find a way that would keep the family intact. I sent back a single line. I will talk, but I will not be erased. When I arrived at Margaret's office, the receptionist showed me immediately to a small parlor of leather chairs and botanical prints. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper. Margaret emerged with a file folder and the unruffled face of a person who had met small storms and large settlements. "Good," she said. "You did well to bring everything. We have options. We can offer a buyout. There's precedent for a reduced buyout if you want a quicker resolution. Or we can prepare for a forced partition and sale, which is more time-consuming but ensures your percentage is liquidated. Or, if you prefer, we can negotiate a conditional agreement that recognizes your 35% and imposes behavioral and financial conditions on the occupants." I listened. Her words were steady and legal. Buyout, forced partition, conditional agreement. But behind each was a human element. I felt that with each clause, the debate was less about paper and more about whether people would agree to be better. "What would a conditional agreement look like?" I asked. She was careful with the answers, the way a physician must be with a prognosis. "It can be generous, allow a reduced buyout rate in exchange for documented behavior changes," she said. "For instance, a reduced figure, say $75,000, if they accept certain financial accountability measures and a timeline to demonstrate independent income. A 60-day employment deadline tied to 2 years of follow-up oversight, perhaps monthly check-ins. It is strict, but it allows for growth. It gives them an opportunity to earn the independence you hoped for when you invested the original money." Her language folded in timelines, 60 days, 2 years, numbers that sound heavy in a sentence but are invisible gates to responsibility. I liked the idea of accountability rather than a simple buyout. I wanted consequences that taught rather than punished. "But," she added, "it's a negotiation. You'll have to offer a signed document and a 30-day deadline for them to accept the terms. Either they buy you out, accept the conditional agreement, or will pursue partition. The 30-day figure dropped into the room like a clock starting. 30 days to decide. 30 days for them to choose whether to accept boundaries or to attempt to erase them. It felt tight and fair in the same breath. If you have ever had to ask someone to change, you know how unclear the world becomes when timelines are involved. They force movement. Margaret suggested we draft the conditional buyout. $75,000 with stipulations. Amanda to secure employment within 60 days and maintain proof of income for 2 years. Monthly financial check-ins. Agreed spending limits on large discretionary purchases. A penalty clause if terms are violated. We would present it with a 30-day decision window. I can hear Amanda's mother arguing that this is punitive, I said, thinking of the ways parents sometimes rally for their adult children. Maybe, Margaret said, or maybe she will insist that her daughter be given the dignity of making things right. Sometimes parents surprise you. Sometimes they see that a bailout only extends dependence. Across the city, I imagined people on both sides of the argument arguing with earnest conviction. I thought of mothers who step in to shield their children and of mothers who realize shielding can suffocate. I thought of the ledger again, the black ink underlines that do not lie. We spent the afternoon crafting language like diplomats. Margaret's fingers moved over the keyboard with the ease of translating ethics into enforceable terms. I read aloud clauses and crossed out words that sounded punitive or vengeful. We wanted terms that sounded firm and fair. Robert would have liked that. He used to say, if you're going to make a stand, make it for something worth protecting. By the time I left her office, the preliminary draft lay in my bag. It had a figure, $75,000, circled in my head like a test. It had a 30-day deadline that felt like a bell. And it had a set of conditions that read less like punishment and more like a strict, compassionate curriculum for adulthood. On the bus ride home, I thought about Amanda's voice rising to say, disappear. The word had been a thin, cruel thing. I folded it in on itself and set it aside. If disappearance was what she wanted, I would not give it to her. I would instead require repair, clear terms, dignity for everyone who was willing to do the work, and a measure of accountability. It is a strange kind of mercy to ask someone to earn the privilege of remaining part of a life. I arrived at my door to find a folded note slipped under it. It was from Barbara Halsworth, Amanda's mother. She had written a short message. I will not enable behavior by bailing out my daughter. Call me. The handwriting was sure and economical, the kind of handwriting people have when they are done with equivocation. Her note was brief, but it carried an unexpected warmth. There are alliances you anticipate and those you do not. This one would be useful. I sat down on my sofa with the paper in my hand and let myself breathe for a moment. The ledger was no longer simply numbers. It had become a map of possible futures. There would be negotiation and resistance, perhaps more accusations. There might be a police welfare check again, or a late-night call. It might be humiliating, and it might be instructive. Mostly, it would be real. When night came, I called Margaret one more time to say, draft it with grace, but make it clear. She laughed softly on the line. Grace with teeth, I know the type, she said. Her voice steadied something in me that had been raw all week. I slept that night like someone who wakes often and remembers why she chose to stand. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating with a name I recognized, Michael. He wanted to meet. He wanted to talk before the 30 days started ticking. I agreed to meet him in a neutral place, a coffee shop with large windows. When I found him there, he looked smaller than his years. His face was the shade of someone who woken into trouble and tried to sleep it away. He reached for my hand. It felt like a child reaching for a parent again. He told me he had always thought of the money as a gift, a mother's unconditional love. He said he regretted the words Amanda had used. He promised, with the unexamined earnestness of a son who needs to be reminded of lessons he learned in childhood, that he did not want to lose his mother. I don't want to lose you either, I said, but love doesn't mean allowing someone to keep taking because they're comfortable with taking. He said nothing for a long time. The coffee hissed, and people in the cafe typed on keyboards with the same kind of urgency as a storm. In that pause, I thought about Robert polishing the silver, about nights we had argued about nothing and then made up with laughter. I thought about how family sometimes becomes the place where people practice their worst habits. "Will you accept the conditional offer?" I asked finally. He looked as if the question had scaled him. "If Amanda will do it, yes," he said, "but you know her. She balks at being told what to do." "Then we'll give her a choice to grow," I told him, "or we will set the other option, partition, and move on. Decisions have consequences, Michael. That is how people learn." He left the cafe with a hope that sounded like a prayer and a promise that might or might not be kept. I sat alone, watching the steam curl from my cup, thinking about the 30 days. The quiet tick of the clock in the corner felt like a metronome for what would come next. When I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I answered with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to customize her expectations. A voice on the other end, formal, precise, said, "Miss Mitchell, this is the front desk at the country club. We received a large number of cancellations and calls about the reception. A reporter is on the phone asking for comment. Tell the reporter I decline to be present for any celebration that insists on my absence," I said, and the sentence felt crisp as the paper I had been carrying. The more I spoke it aloud, the less it sounded like anger and more like a boundary given breath. As I started home, the day felt heavy with possibility. There were so many possible endings: reconciliation, estrangement, long legal maneuverings, apologies, or the slow, painful education that sometimes comes when someone wakes up to their own entitlement. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel invisible. I felt like a woman with a ledger, a lawyer, a son who wanted to repair things, and an opponent who thought erasure was a gift. The bus hummed its way along the avenue. I looked out the window at people who were moving along their own small dramas. Mine was louder, perhaps, but not exceptional. Families always contain storms. Some collapse, some rearrange, some come out the other side with a strange new light. When I unlocked my apartment that evening, the message light on my answering machine blinked. There was a voicemail from an unknown number, and when I pressed play, a woman's voice said, breathless and sharp, "We have to do something. Are you okay?" I listened and knew, somewhere inside, that the next days would be full of small, relentless choices. I would need to decide whether to hold the conditional offer as a hand extended or as a gate closed. I would have to hold my dignity open enough for them to step through if they chose to. It was a strange lesson. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let people feel the consequences of their choices and to remain present with a stern heart. Later that night, as I laid the deed on the kitchen table beside my teacup, I read it again. 35%, $87,000 down, $37,000 in other help, $124,000 in total. Numbers are blunt instruments. They cut through excuses and leave a clean edge. I knew there would be bargaining, perhaps tears, perhaps recriminations. There might even be a welfare check filing from someone panicked enough to call the police. I did not fear the police, but I knew that line could be used as a lever. Margaret's words returned to me in the hush. Prepare the draft. Offer $75,000 with conditions. If they refuse, we pursue partition. The 30 days would be the metronome. It would mean a little fear and a little courage every morning. As I cleaned up the dishes, I thought about disappearance again. Amanda had offered it as a gift. I had refused. Disappearing is too easy a heartbreak to allow. Instead, I would be present, visible in my papers, in my requests, and in my refusal to accept being dismissed. The ledger on the table was more than a list of transactions. It was a record of choices made across decades. Love and support, yes, but also a life lived that had value independent of what others decided to call it. When the phone rang much later and a neighbor asked how I was doing after hearing the news, I said quietly, "I'm fine. I'm preparing." She chuckled kindly, as if the word preparing was already a kind of victory. Perhaps it was. Some things we do because they are necessary. Some things we do because they are deserved. I had given my son a start when he needed it. Now I was insisting that his adulthood must bear the weight of its own decisions. And maybe that was the cruel truth of growing up. The day someone realizes you can say no and mean it is the day they begin, finally, to measure themselves. The next morning, the mailbox contained a single envelope from Jessica at the country club confirming the cancellation and the refund status of the $14,000 deposit. The paper felt like punctuation. The refund process would take time. The cancellation already had its ripple, calls from acquaintances, the watchful eye of the neighborhood, the curious eyebrows of old friends at the coffee shop. Public consequences have a way of making private mistakes feel illuminated. I took all of it in. The ledger on my table looked less like a nuisance and more like a compass. If they chose reconciliation, it would be with work and apology. If they chose denial, the law and the papers would make things clear. But either path required movement. No one changes by being protected from consequence forever. As the sun set, painting the tops of the buildings a warm orange, I sat with the draft Margaret had prepared spread across my kitchen table like a plan someone had finally given me permission to use. The words had teeth, yes, but they were shaped as an invitation to grow rather than a cudgel. 30 days, $75,000, 60 days for Amanda to find paid employment, 2 years of oversight, monthly check-ins, penalties for breaches. All of it felt precisely calibrated to say, you may not erase me, you may choose to earn your place. The next morning, I walked to the post office and mailed the package myself. There was something satisfying about handing the envelope to a clerk whose hands were practiced in passing paper and stamps. Margaret had insisted we deliver it in person if possible, but there is a dignity in distance when the thing you are doing is asking a child to act like an adult. I wanted the offer to be clear, not a trap. I wanted the terms to read like a fair adult education, accountability with a second chance attached. Word traveled faster than I expected. Within an hour of the letter leaving my hands, Amanda called, breathless and furious. "You can't do this, Dorothy," she said, voice high as if someone had turned the wrong knob on a stereo. "You can't set terms for my life." "I didn't set terms for your life," I said. "I set terms for mine. I offered a way for you to keep the house if you choose to do the work." "This is extortion," she said. "You're trying to buy our home back at a steal." "It's not a steal," I said. "It's a conditional buyout that recognizes my investment and your opportunity to become independent." "You're humiliating us," she snapped. "I don't want to humiliate anyone," I replied. "I want us to be a family where adults take responsibility. If humiliation is your read, then perhaps we should reframe it as an invitation to dignity." She hung up. I called Michael. He came by an hour later, carrying a bag of groceries, as if to anchor himself in something banal. He sat across from me, hands folded, and apologized again, this time with the weary steadiness of a man who had run out of excuses. "Mom, I don't know how to make Amanda understand," he said. "She's frightened. She's never had to not have immediate help." "I understand fear," I said, "but enabling fear doesn't help anyone. It just prolongs the terror." He flinched a little at the word enabling, as if it had been applied to a thing he hadn't realized he was holding. If she takes a job, will you consider the buyout less punitive? Will you make room for her to be human? Margaret's draft had already answered him. $75,000, reduced price for quick resolution, a 30-day decision window, 60 days for proven employment. It seemed compassionate to me because it asked for work, not perfection. It asked for evidence of effort. When I said that aloud, Michael's shoulders unclenched. "I'll talk to her," he promised. "I'll ask her to look at the document, but I can't guarantee she'll like it." We were a family practiced in avoidance. Now we were learning to be practiced in conversation. Within the week, the envelope, signed for and stamped, sat on my kitchen table like a gauntlet. Amanda read it once, then twice, and muttered words like blackmail and humiliation between the lines. Michael, at her side, pressed his palm to the paper and said things like, "We can work through this," and "She's my mother." The language of loyalty has many colors. Sometimes loyalty looks like reflexive defense, sometimes like willingness to undergo discomfort for a better future. Barbara Hayworth's note had felt like an odd, hopeful addendum. I had not expected Amanda's mother to step into the ring, not because I doubted Barbara's strength, but because maternal alliances tend, in my observation, to default to shielding. But Barbara had a way of seeing people as they are. When she called me a week after her note, her voice had a firmness that surprised me. "Dorothy," she said, "I read your terms. I won't be bailing my daughter out." "You're sure?" I asked, astonished and grateful. "I'm sure," she replied. "She needs to learn to stand. I won't make her dependent by paying off her choices. You did what's necessary, and I respect that." When I told Michael, he looked as if a weight had been taken from him, yet he also looked frightened. It turns out it is harder to ask your partner to face consequences than to ask a stranger. The people closest to us provide the rawest mirrors. Amanda's first response was to refuse. She refused to sign. She accused me, in increasingly public ways, of trying to take their dignity. She posted a few angry, tear-edged comments on social media, little storms of sentiment that drew friends into polarized camps. There were calls from old neighbors, from church members who remembered when I had mended potluck dishes and canned peaches in summer. Some messages were scolding, others quietly supportive. It is remarkable how much noise will find a person when you do something that demands their attention. On day 12, Amanda and Michael walked into Margaret's office together. They wore matching defensiveness like identical cloaks. Amanda's face was hard in the way people shape their features when they are certain they will not cry. Michael kept stealing looks at me as if scanning for a sign that I would relent. Margaret sat behind her desk like a calm head of state. She laid out the options again, the buyout for $75,000, the partition path, or the conditional agreement with its 60-day employment clause and 2-year oversight. Her voice did not judge. It framed. That day, I could see Amanda hearing parts of it she had not allowed herself to imagine. A calendar with dates, meetings with a financial counselor, the awkwardness of having her spending monitored monthly. "This is humiliating," Amanda whispered finally. "Humiliation is not my aim," I said, leaning forward a little so my voice would travel gently across the room. "I regret that you feel that way. I want you to have the house if you will do what it takes to live in it responsibly. I want you to become the person you can be when the training wheels are off." She stared at me as if she were seeing something new. Not an enemy, not a bank account, but a person who demanded dignity for herself and offered an organized path for others to regain their own. "I won't sign if it means you profit," she said, anger resurfacing. It's not about profit, Margaret replied. It's about recognizing past contributions and creating a structure so the household can sustain itself without repeated rescues. There was a long silence. I could feel the 30 days like a tide, patience and pressure and time moving inexorably toward a decision. Amanda's mother, Barbara, walked in at minute 32. She had arranged it that way. She said later she wanted to be present to bear witness. Her eyes met Amanda's with a mixture of love and firmness I found disarming. Barbara sat down, unflinching. Amanda, she said softly, I will not write a check to keep you from changing what you need to change. I love you. I also know that enabling doesn't protect you in the long run. Amanda looked as if someone had held up a plate of ice in front of her face. In a swift, loud movement, part dramatic theater, part exhausted surrender, Barbara reached into her purse, pulled out a small envelope, and tore it open. Out came a check, but instead of sliding it across, she ripped it in half and handed the 2 pieces to Amanda. I would rather teach you to mend than I would repair your habits with money, she said. I won't be complicit in keeping you from standing. It was a small theatrical act, and yet it was also a pivot. People cheered in their own minor ways, those of us who know that love sometimes wears a stern coat. Amanda cried then, unexpected, quick, messy tears that changed the temperature in the room. The tears did not solve things, but they did open a crack through which apology might one day grow. 2 days later, after a night of shouting and some icy silence, Michael called to say Amanda would sign the conditional agreement. The 30-day clock stopped with signatures, ink pressing the terms into the world. She did it not without bitterness, nor without the occasional snipe. Signing legal papers doesn't rewrite decades of habits in a day. It only says there's an expectation for the next step. The 60-day employment deadline dropped like a metronome into the weeks that followed. I watched Amanda stumble through job applications with the same private sort of hope you have for any adult learning to live on their own. There were interviews that fizzled, and then one with a local boutique that served as a small, steady beginning. Amanda's first paycheck came in a little envelope with 2 smiley faces from the manager. She bought a modest breakfast casserole for her shift team and posted a photo that said, quietly, "First day." Months do funny things. They smooth corners and create places where honesty can live. Amanda's calloused laugh returned, less brittle than before. She learned to stretch a grocery list and to say no to purchases that promised quick joy. Michael learned to let her handle some setbacks and not to rush in with his own checkbook. There were setbacks, a car needing repairs, a tense moment over an overdue bill. But the structure of the agreement meant that the responses were different. Amanda had to report monthly. She had to show proof of income. She had to talk through budgets with a counselor they agreed on. There were no dramatic shows, no parades of shame, just the steady, plodding labor of someone learning to stand. In the background of those months, my life changed too. I took my share of the $75,000 and made practical choices. I found a smaller, sunlit apartment with a balcony that looked over a quiet street. The place smelled of lemon and cedar, which felt like a good omen. I painted one wall a soft blue and planted herbs in the window box. It was not the Victorian. It wasn't meant to be. It was a deliberate, contented life, pared down to things I chose for myself. I also met Frank. We were seated at the same church benefit when someone insisted he sit with me because there were no other seats. He had a laugh that sounded like a piano chord and a way of looking at people as if each person carried their own little constellation. He was gentle, steady, interested in my stories, but not lost in them. We discussed books, then the nonsense of trying to keep houseplants alive, and later, quietly, the small embarrassments of being single in your 70s. Our friendship began like a slow bloom, coffee, then a concert, then a casual movie matinee. He did not arrive like a rescue, he arrived as company. Resolving the house matter did not mean perfection returned to our family overnight. There were dinner table conversations that required more tact than training could provide. There were afternoons when Amanda's old entitlements surfaced and we had to call each other back. But substance matters. Amanda found a steady job, then a promotion to store manager 18 months after she first stepped over the threshold. Her voice changed in the way of someone who had held a ledger and realized it could speak to her, not accuse her. She apologized more than once to Michael and to me, not always in dramatic speeches, but in steady gestures, helping out at Thanksgiving, bringing flowers without expectation, participating in the monthly check-ins with an increasingly responsible face. There were awkward, beautiful moments, like the first time Amanda invited me to a small weekday lunch at a cafe near her store. I hesitated for a breath because I had been cautious for a long time, but I went. She arrived thin-voiced and careful, and then, after appetizers and a nervous order of lemon tart, she looked at me and said, simply, "I'm sorry I ever made you feel like you weren't welcome." That sentence landed somewhere soft. It was not an erasure of the past, it was an acknowledgement of responsibility. After the lunch, we walked along a small river walk, and Amanda told me about the training program she had completed and how she had started saving a little each month. She admitted the most painful thing, that part of her resistance had been pride and fear. Pride is a sticky thing. You think it protects you, and instead it keeps you small. Her confession did not absolve her of earlier cruelties, but it did allow me to let the rigid edge of my boundary ease. Our reconciliation was not a cinematic rush. It was not a banquet with confetti. It was small acts. Her calling when she would be late, a card on Mother's Day, Michael inviting me to a barbecue and meaning it. There were relapses, weeks when Amanda spent impulsively and had to answer to the agreed constraints, nights when Michael would call crying about an argument. Those nights taught me patience and the difference between being an enforcer and being someone who models living inside boundaries. I learned to be both. David Rodriguez's report, Detective Rodriguez, as the official file called him, was an odd, quiet exclamation point on the whole affair. He had filed only the initial contact as a welfare call. After the dust settled and no evidence of abuse was found, his report was concise and neutral. Documentation provided, no signs of coercion. It wasn't vindication so much as an administrative check that the family had been messy but not criminal. That, strangely, felt like a mercy too. It meant the problem had not been systemic incapacity, but interpersonal entitlement. A year in, I moved permanently into my new apartment. The floors were cleaner than I had been used to. The kitchen was smaller than the Victorians had been, but easier to maintain. My balcony became an herb garden. I hosted neighbors for small coffee gatherings. Frank and I saw a play together and argued about its ending in the car on the way home. Not every day was joyful, but most days were chosen. I took to afternoon walks and to a book club that let me talk about literature with strangers who became friends. 2 years after the signatures, the monitoring period drew to a close. The monthly check-ins had become a rhythm, not a chain. Amanda had kept a job, then built a modest emergency fund, then a small retirement contribution, practical things we all delay because life is busy. She had a childlike, fierce pride in the smallness of these wins. Her arc had been imperfect, halting, and real. In the final meeting with Margaret, there were few words, mostly paperwork verifying compliance. The final clause lifted like a weight. We all learned to breathe differently. When the last formal check-in closed, I felt an odd, unadorned relief. Not triumph exactly, not even full forgiveness. More like satisfaction that consequences had not been used as weapons, but as lessons. Consequences, it turned out, were a kind of instruction manual when wielded with intention rather than anger. The family had rearranged itself into a new constellation, less about obligation and more about voluntary connection. Michael came to visit my small apartment on Sunday afternoons. Amanda hosted a holiday and made a point to include me. Sometimes Amanda and I laughed about the petty things, the time she had once told me to disappear like it was the simplest solution to a messy emotion. Once, at a small dinner, she looked at me across the table and said quietly, "I meant none of that. I was afraid." "You said it," I told her, and then added, because I could now be both honest and warm, "and it hurt. But you also did the work. So here we are, scuffed but together." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I thought of the Victorian house, the maple trees, the staircase where a dress had once hung. Those things were memories now, not battlegrounds. Robert's laugh entered my head. "Dorothy, your life is half civic duty and half romance." I had learned to make my civic duty call for respect and my romance to be an intentional joy. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the path I chose, the quiet escalation into law and ledger, the public cancellation of a reception, the months of checking. I do not regret asking for dignity. There were moments when I was tempted to return to the old way. Quiet acquiescence, the soft acceptance of being taken for granted. But when someone tells you the best gift would be your disappearance, they are asking for your erasure. The most kindly thing you can do for them, and for yourself, is to refuse the erasure and insist on a future where accountability teaches better choices. On a brisk autumn afternoon, I walked with Frank along the river, and we talked about small things, the play we'd seen, a new bakery on the corner, his childhood dog. He joked about my propensity to keep receipts, and I laughed in return. We ate lemon tart at a cafe and watched the world go by. There was joy in the little things, not loud joy, just the steady kind that arrives when you have decided to be present. I still keep the ledger, of course, not for punishment, but for memory and clarity. The columns of numbers remind me of the life Robert and I built and of the practical reality that generosity should be conscious. I keep the $87,000 figure in my head like a landmark and the $37,000 like a trail of breadcrumbs. Together, they add up to $124,000, a number that once felt heavy enough to bow a shoulder and now feels like a map. It mapped where I had been and where I refused to be taken again. Sometimes at night, I will sit on my balcony with a cup of tea and think of the day Amanda spoke the title line aloud, the one you heard at the beginning of this story, and how everything after that hinge was less about punishing and more about inviting. The best wedding gift would be if you disappeared from our family. The phrase still stings, but not in the way it did in the first hours. It teaches me who I am to others. It taught Amanda an honesty about herself. It taught Michael the limits of reflexive protection. And it taught my friends and neighbors that the measure of love is not only what one gives, but how one preserves one's own worth in the act of giving. There were evenings I would relive some of the rougher moments, the call to the police, the way the local paper had trimmed our story into a neat paragraph, and I would feel the pulse of indignation. But those were moments, not anchors. The narrative chose a different arc, not humiliation returned like a boomerang, but change coaxed out by structure and by consequences that were, in their way, humane. If you're watching this and walking through something like it, know this. Boundaries are a strange, tender thing. They look punitive from the outside sometimes, but what they often are is a last attempt at teaching someone to survive independently, to hold themselves to account. They are not cruelty. They are a form of love that has learned to be practical. Amanda and I are not best friends in the way we used to be. There is no foolishness that would pretend wounds evaporated overnight. But we have a steady, working relationship now. We text like adults about appointments and weather, We share a holiday meal, and she sometimes stops by my apartment with a small, silly thrift store find she thinks I'll like. Michael is less frantic and more present. We all moved in our different ways toward the tedious but sturdy business of living well. On a windy afternoon at a small family lunch, Amanda came up behind me and kissed my cheek. "I wouldn't tell you to disappear anymore," she said, soft as the day her dress had hung like a cloud over the banister. "Not in a million years." I pressed her hand and felt the warmth of an old, cautious reconciliation. "Good," I said, "because disappearing is too easy. Staying and learning, that's the harder, kinder path." If you have a story like this, if you've been dismissed by someone you loved when you gave them everything, tell me about it. Share in the comments where you are from, what you had to count, and what boundary felt like the bravest thing you did. If this story resonates, subscribe to the channel so we can keep these conversations going. You are not alone in the ledger of life. The ledger taught me another thing, one that surprised me. There is dignity in asking for fairness, and there is grace in allowing someone to earn back their place. The world is messy, and so are people. But sometimes the kindest gift you can give the people you love is the chance to be accountable for themselves, not to spare them from consequence, but to teach them the means of being steadier companions in the years to come. And if anyone ever says to you, ever again, the best wedding gift would be if you disappeared from our family, remember that you do not have to disappear for others to have their dances. You are not a decorative object to be removed when inconvenient. You are a person with a ledger of your own life, with memories and dignity and the right to decide whether you will bow out or stand firm. My choice was to stand, to press the paper into a place that asked for repair, not revenge. If the result was sometimes hard, it was also humane, and in the end, that felt like the better gift of all.